It's a pleasure to be with everyone today and really look forward to the subject that we have in front of us to discuss. One of the ideas that came to us as we were putting our book together a bit ago was this idea that there's a dimension of leadership that we're calling alignment leadership or alignment leaders, is something that we're seeing more and more, not only out in industry as we work with different executives, but it's something that we're also seeing more and more in the writing. And the idea is, something that I think is compelling, something that is increasingly relevant, and something that increasingly sets apart some organization executives from others as it pertains to their ability to effectively lead organization transformation. Now, at AlignOrg Solutions, we do a lot of organization transformation work. We specialize in organization design and change management, and we work with our clients all the time to help them navigate sort of the long and rocky road sometimes that an organization transformation requires. And as we get into this subject today, I'd like to be able to share some stories and some accounts from different organizations that we've had a chance to work with, in hopes that that will become a way for you as you reflect on your own organization and your own leaders and maybe even your own set of skills, how you can better incorporate the principles of alignment leadership. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what do you mean when you say an alignment leader? Well, we're going to get into that here in just a few minutes, but I'd like to sort of set the stage by putting out there a set of principles, I guess, as it pertains to what we're seeing out in industry and out in different organizations. The first way we want to look at this is in relation to the business environment and the relative impact that environment has on our organizations. And as we look at this issue, there are sort of two really relevant dimensions. The first one I'll look at on the vertical axis that deals with how integrated the solutions, products, and services are that our various organizations are delivering. What we're seeing is an overall trend toward greater development of solutions, bundling, experiences, and this whole integrated value proposition that is going to customers or consumers. And what used to be a distinctive product a few years ago maybe is no longer in and of itself distinctive because it's so easy to replicate a product. It's so easy for a product or a service to be commoditized in a sense. And so something more sophisticated actually has to be bundled around the offering that an organization has. So that's sort of the first dimension, dealing with the offering integration. The next dimension is related to the complexity of the organizations that we often work in. What would be great, I suppose, is that you work in an organization that has one clear and distinct offering to the marketplace. You sell one thing. But the reality is most organizations have, for a desire to grow and to become more relevant to the different customers they serve, they end up taking on multiple marketplace positions, and they actually try to win in multiple ways or multiple places. And so now you see large organizations, the GEs of the world, the Danahers of the world, that are piecing together related products and services, but are doing so so that they can face off against multiple market segments and really grow their business. And so if you have these two dynamics, a desire for greater integration of the service or product offerings that you're bringing to market, and also an increase in the number of customers and segments that you're going after, you're getting a great deal of complexity. And in light of that, what we're seeing is that not only are organizations themselves becoming more complex, so an organization that's perfectly aligned to address a few or one distinct market position with a fairly clear and distinct product or service is clearly not the same kind of organization that might be required to deliver many marketplace positions or multiple highly integrated products and service offerings. And the reality is that the organizational forms that are required in both of those spaces are going to be quite different. And you hear all sorts of, buzzwords around different kinds of organization structures and forms and governance and things like that, networked organizations, virtual organizations, matrixed organizations, and so forth. All of that aside, the fundamental and root issue is that if your organization is competing in a more complex setting or marketplace, in the ways that we've just talked about, the reality is it has big implications for not only how your the organization is set up, but also for those that lead it. So if we carry this notion forward, one of the ideas that, as I mentioned earlier, that we brought forward in our book, Mastering the Cube, and just for context, those maybe that aren't familiar with that, we use an analogy in the book of a Rubik's Cube. And the Rubik's Cube represents this idea that organizations are multidimensional, that one side of the Rubik's Cube is the work of the organization. Another side of the Rubik's Cube is the structure of the organization. Another side of the cube is the metrics of the organization, and so forth. And you go through these different dimensions. And the reality is, as your business gets more complex and as the speed of change in your industry goes up, the people who have to orchestrate the design of the organization have to take on an increased amount of what we call alignment leader capabilities or competencies. In other words, they can't just be great operations folks, or they can't just be great financial or cost folks. They have to be able to look at all of the organizational systems, again represented by the organizational cube, if you will, and they have to make sure that the way we do work, which might be highly efficient, also matches to what we count and measure, which sounds obvious. What we're finding is with the complexity of organizations these days, that it's very difficult for leaders to sort of keep a pulse on all of that. They try to wrap their arms around what they can control and what they feel like they can influence, and then they sort of hope all the rest will fall into place. And what we're discovering is that hope, while well-intentioned, is probably not adequate. There actually needs to be some development on behalf of leaders and executives to really start to understand how to look at an organization in all of its respective moving parts and pieces in a way that is far more systematic and complete and holistic, so that the organization in the end can take on the form that will allow it to win. Years ago, I was working with a small company that for 80 years had a very specialized, distinct marketplace position. It was the market leader in its space. And as they started to look into the horizon, they finally started to see the end of their market dominance coming. And so they decided to go out and acquire some related businesses. And here's what happened. Those leaders went out and they bought some businesses, and those businesses were also very good businesses. And the thought was if they could couple them together, they could really enhance the overall offering. On paper, it made all the sense in the world. In reality, what happened is the person who went out and identified these targets, orchestrated the deals, and ultimately brought those new acquisitions into the company, ended up running those organizations for the next 3.5 years before finally he raised his hand and he said, I can't do this anymore. You're asking me to go continue to look for new acquisitions and bring them in, and I'm ending up running all of these other businesses that we acquire, and these businesses now represent over half of our overall business. And the reason he raised his hand is because the businesses they were acquiring had nowhere to go into the organization and structure that they had historically used for their business. Now, again, this seems very, very obvious, but if you come from a legacy organization that, is used to operating a certain way, as complexity increases because of the solution integration or because of the new and increased number of marketplace positions, the structure and design of the organization by default is going to have to morph, and the leaders who have come out of the legacy organization are the ones that ultimately have to orchestrate, lead, and facilitate the movement of that organization into a place where it can effectively deal with the new marketplace reality. And this is sort of the gap that we are sensing and seeing out there, and why we feel like this issue of alignment leadership is such a critical one. So as we move forward in our discussion today, there's sort of three principles or concepts that we want to spend a few minutes on that we believe are going to help the listeners today, and maybe even the folks that you work with in your organizations, become more effective alignment leaders. So the first concept that we're going to cover, and some of these are a bit tongue-in-cheek, is an idea that spins off of an old Gatorade ad, and I'll show that here in a minute, that basically is the story of a leader named Michael Abbott, who is referenced in our book, but he represented a leader who took on some of these characteristics in a financial services organization that underwent a great deal of change. And we're going to talk a little bit about his story and try to distill out of that some of the characteristics of alignment leadership that we think are portable and we think that leaders can take on as they go forward. Second point we want to cover is that alignment leadership may feel like it's about the person or it's about people, but the reality is the underlying premise and power, really, of the alignment leader notion is not in the people, but more in the system and how they can orchestrate what goes on in the system. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the idea that alignment leaders do face real headwinds and hurdles as they work through their organization, and they're constantly confronted with, how do I make progress without stumbling over some of these things that tend to crop up? So these are the three topics that we'd like to get into today. And as Holly said at the kickoff, if, as we're going through this, you have questions or thoughts or even feedback, I invite you to go ahead and submit that so that toward the end we can open up a Q&A and talk about these principles in action and how they might apply.